It's really a common thing for artists who are interested in the world around them, the world that they know well, and responding to that world. It's really common for them to go to the most obvious place, which is the view out the front window or out the front door, and that certainly works for me as well. And there's a few paintings in this show that are basically responses to the view from our shack up in the Sandy Straits, which is a passage of water north of Brisbane between Fraser Island and the mainland. And when we look out from where I paint, we look across probably a couple of miles of water over to Fraser Island. There's a couple of little islands. There's the jumble of sheds on the shoreline in the foreground. And all the time when you're looking out there, it's a small place, so it's always in our view, it's changing. And all those changes, they sort of bury themselves in your mind. So that view becomes like a laboratory for an artist. You can start to, looking at the same thing, you can start to test out ideas and how you see it in a different way and how you respond to it in different ways. And even when we're back down in Brisbane, of course, you have a memory of those places too. So it's interesting to look at the different paintings in this show, and you can kind of see how that's working. This painting of the Sandy Straits with a passing storm, it's a time when the light just completely shifts that common view of greens and blues that makes up our coastal landscape that sometimes you can get sick of. It switches off and it all becomes silvers. The water's this kind of shifting, shimmering, silvery haze, and it throws the colours on everything else into a much higher relief, not to mention the drama of the showers passing through. But we'll look at a couple of other paintings and you can see there's a whole different kind of feeling that I'm responding to. So these two paintings they're the same view out from the deck where I paint up in Puna. Looking across to Fraser Island again, but in this painting, the slightly larger one, it was a day, it's a very, very common up there unfortunately, but it's days where the wind just roars, it just roars down the straits, gets funneled between Fraser Island and the mainland. And the waters across to Fraser, there's out in front of the shack, there's probably 300-400 metres of shallow sand flats, and then it drops down into the channel. And when the wind blows, the waves over those flats, when there's a metre or so of water, they just come alive. You know where they talk about waves as horses from. This white foam is just sort of flying all day long. It looks more like a New Zealand rapids in a river than the ocean in a way. And it just totally demands your attention. And there's a kind of there's a narrative to that, you know, like the whole thing about storms and water and boats out at sea. You can't help but imagine those sorts of things, but just visually it demands your attention. And all this was it was probably painted in an hour, but it was a direct response to what was happening out in front. And this little one, just by way of contrast, it was again painted directly. I'm looking at the view while I was painting, but it was one of those days where the wind just completely disappears. The water just glasses out and everything becomes incredibly still and crystal kind of clear. And the painting, I think, is just responding to that different day and that different mood and a different kind of way of trying to paint it. Same sheds, same patch of water, same islands, but a very different response. Yeah, so there's a few different sets of paintings in this show. If I try to describe them broadly, some of them are series of paintings in response to bush landscapes. Another set of what we might call them boat paintings, but they're basically paintings that are responses to being out on the water, being around boats, being on the shoreline. And there's also a series of paintings about being on the road. So these paintings, fairly obviously, are a few of the ones that are part of the boat paintings. And when you're out on the water, the landscape that you're in is just markedly different from when you're in the bush. All of a sudden the sky opens up, the foreground opens up, you're out on the water, it's a moving platform. The water's reflecting the sky and the sand's reflecting the sky and the water and so on. And everything gets put in this sort of strange, clear silhouette. Objects become really obvious, and the scale is gigantic. So the paintings I just find they tend to open themselves up. They're not full of a lot of detail, but when there is something there, it tends to be obviously an object. The other thing that's sort of a bit of an enigma with that is that everything's usually moving. You're usually on a boat which is moving. The horizon is shifting. The various things in the water relative to each other are moving in positions all the time. And in this place where I am, which is between Fraser and the mainland, there's barges going back and forth all the time, and they're big objects in the landscape. But they disappear in and out behind the waves. You get that shimmering off the water and they come into focus and out of focus, and of course, being those kind of industrial machines, they're always in sort of, fairly obvious geometric colours as well. But unless they're still, which they are in a couple of the paintings, and moving, then they actually become vague. You're not quite sure what they are, except they're these strange moving objects in the landscape. And they set up and they link the various parts of the landscape because you can see they're travelling from one part to another. Okay. So some of the what we call landscape bush paintings, as opposed to the boat paintings, about half of them are responses to the landscape a fair way north of Brisbane, but starting to get closer to Cooloola and the Sandy Straits. It's all that area around Gympie, White Bay. It's a beautiful rolling country, very ancient, and the area that we're always moving through, driving through usually, has a kind of history of dairy farms and cattle, a little bit of agriculture, and some of the really wild kind of forest. You tend to see these kind of long, distant views with the silhouette of the mountains, and the skies always seem to be full of clouds that are moving, so the landscape's constantly coming into light and shadow moving. The paintings are not descriptions of that visual field, that separation of sky, mountains, foreground and so on. Some of them are more obviously just picking out the spatiality of that country, the stands of trees that are left between paddocks and fence lines, and the running trees that go along the edges of creeks and so on. They pick themselves out against the landscape background. So that's in the paintings, but they're also just trying to work with the actual process of painting on the canvas and making marks, and I'm interested in getting those brush strokes as thin as I possibly can, so the the response seems more immediate and more gestural. There's not much room for mistake. You put the paint down and you can't really go over it, or it loses all that transparency. So a lot of the construction of the paintings then is about patches of colour and the way those patches of colour relate to one another, as well as their kind of contrast and their density. So I also have quite a few paintings in the show that I did when I came home from a trip late last year to Kyoto and the area around Kyoto. I've always been fascinated by Japanese landscape. Of course, for many architects, Japanese architecture and Japanese landscape has always been a great influence, and it certainly has been on my own work. But this trip I had the chance to really spend time in the traditional Japanese gardens that I'd never had before. And I spent sort of 5 weeks just basically sketching and painting in these gardens, and then came home and did some larger paintings from those works. And it was really interesting, you know, you kind of think Japanese gardens are quite often described as contrived landscapes that are meant to sort of be miniatures of the larger landscapes. And you can certainly find examples of that, and there's, you know, what they might sometimes call the Zen gardens with the flat gravel plain and the rock gardens, and they obviously are working in a very contrived way. But when you actually visit the gardens, the scale of them, they're usually very large. They're very large trees and big scale landscapes, and quite wild. And I was enthralled by them. The process of painting in them, I didn't find that different from working in the bush in southeast Queensland. But what was interesting was the different ways that the gardens were structured, and the different kind of spaces that the different species of trees, much more common use of water, and water set up in ways that you see the reflections of the trees and the reflections of the skies, which makes again for a very shifting landscape. And in that way the paintings are a lot different from the boat paintings, in that the landscapes that I'm in, instead of having a relatively static field of view, the breeze is always moving branches and leaves. The sun is always changing the shadows of what are some quite complex environments. So again, the painting is trying to allow for that shifting view, to the uncertainty of what you're actually looking at. Is it a leaf, or is it the shadow of a leaf? Is it a reflection, or is it the real thing? And in the process of doing those 10 or 15 paintings, I was really immersing myself in those kind of emotive and visual responses that I had to the Japanese gardens.